to today's webinar, the Pulse of Procurement 2018, your annual checkup on the Prognosis for Procurement. My name is Richard Waugh from Zycus, and I'll introduce my co-presenter momentarily. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a couple of quick housekeeping tips and tricks for using Webex so the audio comes through your computer speakers. Chat box gives you the opportunity to log in any questions for Q&A as well as any technical issues. In case of any technical problems, we have the email address webcast@zycus.com. And all participants today within 48 hours after the webinar will receive an attachment with the slide deck, and you'll receive your continuing education credit as well for attending today. As I mentioned, my name is Richard Waugh. I'm with Zycus, your host for the event today. A little bit about my bio, but I'd rather talk about my co-presenter, Steve Hughes. Steve is the Chief Procurement Officer at the College Board, and his career has spanned over 30 years in senior procurement and operations positions with large, small, public and private, for-profit as well as non-profit organizations. Steve joined the College Board in 2016 after serving as Vice President of Global Sourcing at the National Geographic Society. Prior to that, VP of Supply Chain Management at Vertus Communications. He's also held positions at Comcast Group, and began his career at Hallmark Cards, his career in procurement in Kansas City following 5 years of military service as a U.S. Army officer at Bragg, North Carolina, where he completed 40 military parachute jumps. Thank you for your service, Steve, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So, as we said, Zycus has been conducting this survey on an annual basis for the past several years, Pulse of Procurement. It's really just what the name implies, a chance for us to take the pulse of what's trending, what's happening in the procurement market, and we got a lot of information to share with you today from this study for 2018. The methodology for the study, it's had broad-based participation, which I think means we've got a very statistically valid sample size. Over 400 procurement professionals participated in a great cross-section of very large enterprise to mid-size enterprises, an even distribution across the globe as you look geographically, and a good mixture of senior leadership and practitioners within the procurement function to give a holistic kind of 360-degree view of what's going on, including some 6% CPOs, Steve, like yourself, and I know you were a participant in the study as well. It's one of the reasons why so glad to have you here as we go through the data to help me interpret and provide some perspective and insight on all these key findings. So why don't we get started? So I start with the present, no time like the present, right? Kind of look at what's the state of procurement according to these over 400 procurement leaders and practitioners. And first we kind of start with the big picture strategic view. Does your procurement and sourcing organization have a mandate to manage spending from an enterprise level? Overall, the respondents, about 61% said yes. Larger enterprises, a little bit more likely to have that mandate. But look at a strategic mandate, sometimes is in the eye of the beholder. In this case, it's all in how you define a mandate. So, Steve, in your experience as a CPO, what do you think constitutes a mandate to manage spending at an enterprise level?
So, Rich, I think that the mandate can be defined as possibly two ways in which we in procurement might interpret a mandate. One is with having a procurement policy, and if you have a policy that's written in such a way that it defines the organization's responsibilities to follow certain procurement practices, then the compliance with that policy is, in a sense, a mandate. On the other hand, another aspect of mandate is what does the executive team of the organization feel about the procurement organization, and to what degree does the procurement organization's boss or the whole entire executive team support the activities of the procurement team. And I think to the degree in which those executives continue to pay both support as well as by their actions, then procurement can in fact have a mandate from on high. So I think those, to me, represent the two areas where we derive our mandates from.
Yeah, perspective. It's great if you've got that air cover and the C-suite is very visible and vocal in their support, but I think to your point as well, Steve, even absent that policy, if it says you have the right to do it or the obligation to do it, it kind of says you have a mandate as well. So start from that view of what's the mandate. We next wanted to look at the relative maturity of organizations and kind of over an evolutionary arc here and asking the respondents to sort of put themselves in one of three buckets. Are they just getting started and starting to gain some early wins? Are they sort of in that intermediate stage of gaining momentum or trying to extend those wins? Or have they kind of arrived, that they've achieved what we would consider to be global best in class? And overall, about 20% feel that they've achieved that status, that global best in class. So I thought it was a good opportunity for us to step back, Steve, and based on your perspective and experience, I think constitutes or characteristics that define best in class.
Well, I think it's always the proverbial $64,000 question, because oftentimes there is not an objective benchmark that defines you as having arrived at best-in-class status. So somewhat in the eye of the beholder. I think I've always felt that every organization I've been a part of, but we were necessarily best-in-class, and I've been a part of a number of different organizations over my career in procurement. It's always been something I've striven for, and I think that in many cases I've been able to move from gaining momentum toward achieving best in class. And I think we all in procurement probably struggle a little bit unless you happen to be those that have taken advantage of all of the resources available and have applied them successfully.
Too, Steve, in the spirit of continuous improvement, even once you feel like you've achieved that best-in-class status, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't additional opportunities to improve and evolve, right?
Precisely.
I think that's a great takeaway for a lot of folks. And not surprising that the vast majority say we're somewhere in the middle. So hopefully we'll get some insights as we go along here to say, how do I close that gap if I'm trying to get to best in class or trying to continue to achieve next level performance, even beyond best in class as well. So we started off kind of trying to, again, take the pulse, take the temperature out there, and understand what are the pain points that many organizations, procurement teams are grappling with these days. And clearly there is no shortage of pain out there. This elicited a number of different responses, things like lack of visibility or data issues, outdated technology, inefficient processes, or risk or compliance, or talent issues. So kind of across the board, different areas that were cited as key pain points. So again, in your experience as a CPO, Steve, what would you say are the biggest pain points that you've experienced and any strategies for overcoming those?
Yeah, so universally, when I've joined an organization, my biggest challenge initially was trying to understand what the spend data told me. And oftentimes, visibility into getting good, accurate spend data was very difficult to achieve with the legacy ERP systems that I was working with. So say that one challenge or pain point was the point that's in the left-hand corner of data. In some cases, even when you could get your hands on the data, it have the granularity of detail that you needed to be able to understand it in a meaningful way. So data is a challenge. I think there is that most of the procurement organizations I've been a part of, we've always felt like we were under-resourced, meaning we were a very small team supporting a very large ambitious goal, and oftentimes lack of time and resources, both in terms of people and tools, was a challenge. And for me, those were the two big points. I mean, I think all these play a part, but those were the things that I've always tried to overcome first.
Right. A number of these come into play, but I think to your point, unless you have that data visibility, it's very difficult, therefore, to formulate strategies or action plans until you have that version of the truth that everyone can agree on. So I think that's a valuable insight, and so a lot of pains, but oftentimes it comes down to where do I start and how do I start to address those pains, and I think that's a great recommendation. We also asked our respondents to tell us about their top priorities for this year, 2018. And again, there are a variety of responses, things, lots interested in doing more with big data, with analytics, supplier relationship management, mobility, green procurement, others, but all of those responses really dwarfed by one clear consensus. That's here. So better than 50% said we're really focused on how do we make this transition from tactical to strategic. And I thought, again, here, Steve, this is an area where your experience can really help identify any practical steps that procurement leaders can take to help accelerate this process and drive the transition from tactical to strategic.
So I'll start by sharing a little bit of the experience I encountered when I joined the College Board. 2 years ago, the team was very much focused on what I would call a tactical approach to procurement, which ensuring that the policies were being complied with, but in terms of activities, primarily issuing POs, signing contracts signed and shepherded through legal and the supplier relationships, and forward-looking activities. So much of it was reactive to the work that was coming through the pipeline. One of the first things I did was not only in terms of reorganizing how the team was structured, but focusing the team from worrying about how metric, how many contracts are we processing, how many POs are we issuing, and how are we doing that, to beginning to develop more focus on getting in front of these projects before they actually came into the procurement work stream. So I think the way which you will ultimately transition from tactical to strategic is changing where you focus your energies. And rather than focusing on the back end of the process, which is how to complete the transactions, it's focusing on the upfront planning and trying to engage stakeholders at a much earlier stage of a project's lifespan. That by creating categories and starting to implement a category management process. We did that by going on a road trip and trying to talk to everybody from the executives right down to the lowest level stakeholders about the new of procurement. And essentially talking in terms of, we're not here to be a cog in the process, nor are we here to be the end of the process, the tail kind of wagging the dog. We're trying to be at the beginning and also provide value through guidance and perspective.
Well, takeaways for me is you kind of shared your experience there, Steve. I know you mentioned measurements, first of all, and it goes back to the old saying that you get what you measure, right? So you sound like you first started to say we're going to focus not on sort of volume or production kind of measurements in terms of transaction volumes, but more on value. And, also, you mentioned critical stakeholders are. So you can to change from a tactical to a more strategic focus, but unless your stakeholders view you that way, it's very difficult to make that transition. So I think really some great advice and takeaways there as well for what seems like the majority of folks really focused on that as their top priority. How do I get from a tactical to a strategic orientation? So I asked, what are your top goals and objectives for 2018? So if they thought, procurement wasn't overworked already, this tells you there's so many things on the plate, so many objectives to be pursued here. Everything from cost savings to supplier performance and compliance, risk management, process efficiencies, cross-functional collaboration, and so on. So be interested in your perspective here. Of course, where would you recommend that those really prioritize or focus their attention when you look at these types of goals and objectives, which really come to the fore for you, Steve?
I attend conferences from time to time, and as I network with my peers, I hear a lot of talk about the fact that if we move into a best-in-class kind of organization, we move beyond cost savings and we begin to focus on some of these other areas. And I'm sure it's all valid, but I go back to an earlier comment I made where I said most of us are not already best-in-class. We're still striving for that. And I found every organization I've been a part of that the thing that was validated by this survey when I look at this slide is the fact cost savings and process efficiencies are at the top of the list in terms of goals and priorities. And are for me, and I do believe that they are for most procurement people. Not that any of these other things aren't important and won't take on big opportunities for advancing the procurement cause in the future, but I find management is primarily concerned with how am I delivering value in the form of tangible cost savings to the organization, and how are we streamlining the procurement process so that it's not so burdensome on the organization. And I trust my team's efforts primarily in those two areas, and I would hope we achieve success in those areas, so then we'll be able to spend some more time talking about some of the other benefits or value-added services that procurement can offer.
And Steve, I know you mentioned earlier the alignment with stakeholders. I'd be curious, when you look at your goals and objectives for your procurement team, how do you correlate those to the overarching goals of the enterprise and the business? How do you make sure that you're in sync with the business goals and objectives?
Yeah, great question. So again, the third highest response on the top goals and objectives is cross-functional collaboration. So as I mentioned in my transition from tactical to strategic, that we've started to emphasize the importance of trying to get engaged in upfront planning with our stakeholders. And so the way which we've done that is try to reach out to them on a quarterly basis to sit down with them and talk about the projects that are in process, but also the projects that are on their radar that are coming in the future. We're going to enter into our budget planning season for next year. We're on a calendar basis, and so over the next 3 to 4 months, a lot of work is going to be invested in putting together 2019 budgets. This is a time when I really put a burden on the team to say, get out there and try to be part of those conversations. Learn not only what their interests and goals are for 2019 as they start to put money behind those goals, but to also understand where procurement fits into those plans. And so absolutely, the ability to have cross-functional collaboration and engage with our stakeholders' opinion is a critical tool for success in being able to deliver cost savings and process efficiencies.
And I guess then, in essence, procurement will achieve its goals and objectives by helping the business stakeholders achieve theirs as well. So it's that symbiotic relationship that really works. So there's on the plate, as we said. So a little bit of good news here. With all those things to be accomplished, at least as we look at the overall budgets for procurement across 3 different dimensions, whether that's an operating, an OpEx budget, a capital expense budget, or just in terms of headcount, all those budgets appear to be on the rise. They seem to be increasing, and that really there are more respondents saying our budgets are going up than say that they're going down. And overall, that in 3 areas are up over our survey from 2017, so from a year ago, as well. So taking a look at this data, Steve, why do you think more organizations are seeing increases in their budgets rather than flat or declining? And what areas do you think CPOs are investing in the future?
Yeah, so I don't know that I have a good crystal ball as to understand how and why all of the data points indicate that budgets are increasing. I can only speak really from my own experience. Our budget did increase this year. Part of it is because the economy is booming, taking advantage of that and using the opportunity to grow our revenue, to also invest in systems, process improvements, and people that can ultimately the mission of the College Board. We're seeing within the College Board, of course, as those of you that may or may not be familiar with the College Board, we are the company that is behind the SAT and the advanced placement programs that are in the high schools. And so as higher education becomes a very important goal for students in high school, we're in the forefront of trying to develop resources to help more and more students succeed in their ability to qualify for college and also to prepare for college. That said, I believe that the things, as you said, asked Richard, is where do we see opportunities to invest in a situation where budgets are increasing? For us this year, we're applying funds to technology. We're trying to upgrade our technology. We've hired this year. We hired an additional staff member on our team. So the combination of staff and now tools are where we're spending extra money. I think that may be true in others, but even if it's not, I think the argument could be made that if your company is expanding, there is a procurement need to expand proportionally to be able to keep up with the demand for our services.
True, and certainly I think this budget increase in procurement budgets it must be correlated to the overall economic expansion and growth, and hopefully also it can attribute part of it to better recognition of the value that's being created by the procurement function, so that there's a tangible ROI from that additional headcount that you've done or investing in upgrading technology and tools and those kinds of things. So a lot of good news, I think, wrapped up in here, and not to be accomplished, of course. So from for those who much is given, much is expected. So that's the good news, is more resources and expectations probably continue to increase as well. So with that in mind, right, it's probably a good point for us to transition and kind of say, well, okay, what is the state of the performance across the board in procurement as we look at a number of key metrics and benchmarks and identify, where organs are really succeeding, maybe where there's some gaps, and just to put those additional resources or funding to work to kind of close any performance gaps that may exist. So as we looked at these performance benchmarks, of course, as you mentioned, Steve, cost savings always will be not the key measure, one of the key measures for almost any procurement organization. And I think it's interesting as we look at the data for 2018, a pretty bullish outlook, and really across the board, regardless of the size of the organization. There's a consensus here about a 9% savings goal for this year, so up slightly at least from 17, in which the larger enterprises were more likely to be more aggressive in terms of savings and somewhat less for smaller or mid-sized organizations. But across the board, everyone's seeing a 9% savings target for this year. And you mentioned sort of the macroeconomic forces already, Steve, and that we're in a period of growth, extended recovery after the recession. It kind of begs the question, do you think these cost savings can be sustained during a period of prolonged recovery and growth?
I don't think I have a crystal ball to be able to answer that definitively, but I will say that, there is an expansion in spending, i.e. as a result of a growth in the business or in terms of revenue growth that leads to more opportunities to invest in the business. My perspective is that opportunities for procurement, at the same time, it also creates some unique challenges. So we all know that in a recession, when budgets are declining and people are trying to get what they need with less money to do it with, they turn to procurement to help them draw some cost out of their process, because the only way they can accomplish their goal or mission. But good economy, when money might be flush, the tendency is I don't need to worry about those small cost savings that procurement can get me. I've got plenty of money in the bank to work with to achieve goals. Again, this kind of goes back to what I said earlier about the importance of engaging with our stakeholders at an early enough stage, ideally at the budgeting phase, when we can begin to interject ourselves into their processes before they've committed themselves to some of the spend that they're about to embark on. So I think the good news is that I believe that the opportunities for procurement are just as robust in a good economy as they are in a lean economy. It's just that maybe the focus changes, where in a lean economy they're coming begging us for help, and then in a economy like we have now, they may be a tendency to ignore us, and we just have to work that much harder and get in front of their spend so we can have an impact.
Right. In some cases during the recession, procurement came in and saved everyone's bacon, right? But now it may mean putting more of a premium on that stakeholder engagement, just as you say, to make sure that willing to invite you to help them in boom times as well as bust times. So that's a great perspective. While we're on this particular metric, it seems to me that cost savings has always been the subject of some debate as to whether you count only cost reduction or is cost avoidance in the mix. So before we move on, I'd be interested in your perspective on how you report cost savings. What's your methodology?
So that is again a proverbial question: is are cost savings purely price reductions of year-over-year spend, or is it legitimate to count cost avoidance, which is oftentimes, perhaps in the eyes of some, discounted as a not valid measurement of cost savings? My perspective is that, again, it depends on the situation. We're in that boom economy. We talked about the bullish outlook that's referred to as slide. Oftentimes that means that suppliers of the goods and services we need are in a mode of raising their prices as opposed to reducing their prices. And so oftentimes in that situation, the best you can do is to mitigate the increases, whether it's mitigating them 100% or just mitigating them partially. But procurement, that mitigation process might not take place at all, and so I still think there's value in procurement counting the cost avoidance impact that we can have on reducing this rate of increase that price increases might occur by. And not to say that we don't still have opportunities to find year-over-year cost savings where we've actually reduced the cost of what we're paying for. And sometimes that can be accomplished through negotiations. Sometimes it can be accomplished by re-engineering the product and changing the specs. And other kinds it can just be through finding a supplier that's more hungry than the one you're dealing with. So both are valid measurements of cost savings, and I think you have to make sure that your upper management or the people that are receiving the information understand that there's a difference, and we don't necessarily look at them the same way, but they are valid in both cases. One last comment. I subject all of our cost savings that we publish to the scrutiny of our internal auditors. I do that on purpose because I want to be able to look my boss in the eye, who is the CFO, and say, I trust these numbers. They've been vetted by our internal audit team. And the internal audit team goes through a rigorous process of looking at the lines that we use to measure how we calculate savings. They look at the documentation that we provide. And in instances, they do find things that are suspect and we correct them. And we will not publish or record cost savings that we can't stand on and stand for the internal auditors and defend.
Yeah, it sounds like a best practice, and it all comes back to the data too. And so unless you can demonstrate it with data, and finance has blessed it, in some organizations, maybe it really happens. So making sure you've got the ability to document and demonstrate savings, I think, sounds like a real best practice and a great suggestion.
I would just add to that, Richard, is that not only is it a best practice, I think it is at the heart of the credibility of the procurement organization's view as being viewed by stakeholders. As too often I've heard stakeholders think that our cost savings are kind of phantom savings because they don't see the impact on their budget.
And now I think with that in mind, with those aggressive cost savings targets that we see, the next one here is really a key one because spend under management does tend to be a leading savings indicator, I think you kind of make the case that unless you're actively managing spend, how can you generate document cost savings? And in this area, average performance here is just only slightly better than 50% of total spend on management. A minority of folks, 15% here, are getting to 80% spend under management plus. But and it probably begs a definition, and I think you could help us again, Steve. How would you define spend under management, and what do you see as its value as a leading indicator of your ability to drive savings?
I agree with you. This is kind of important that it needs to be defined correctly. So I start with the notion that procurement doesn't and can't address all spend. So we have to define, before we can define what spend under management is, we have to define what's addressable. So for me, addressable spend is any kind of spend for which, if procurement was engaged, was involved, it could influence or impact the outcome. So obviously there's certain kinds of obvious kinds of spend, like spend, taxes that go out, reimbursements to employees. There's certain spend that we just simply will never touch, will never have an impact on. But we then carve that out from the total spend and define what is addressable. Then my goal in terms of trying to increase my spend under management is to say that procurement spend management, we are engaged with our stakeholders in ultimately deciding or collaboratively deciding who the supplier is we're going to do business with, what price we're going to pay, and how the terms and conditions get settled. So we may not drive the process as the lead, but if we are engaged to the extent that our voice has been heard, we have the opportunity to have an input, and we're satisfied that the outcomes reflect the decision making we would support, then I call it engaged, and therefore I call it spend under management. It could be that we've selected a vendor that we call a preferred supplier, where we're going to direct all of our spend to that preferred supplier. Could be that it's a single entity kind of contract for a specific service. So as long as engaged, and that could be somewhat ambiguous, but engaged is a subjective term. But nonetheless, I tell my people, if you feel like you have contributed all you can contribute, then that spend is under management, meaning procurement's involvement.
Those are great guidelines and a very helpful definition for folks to follow in terms of spend under management. And we talked about spend under management, about cost savings and those kinds of things. The biggest challenges a lot of organizations face is even after you've control over the category to the point where you include it as managed spend, you've driven some at least identified savings through the same process. Getting to realize savings becomes a challenge for a lot of folks. When we talk about contract compliance, how much of that spend that ultimately results from a purchasing activity or purchase transaction is compliant to the contract, that is with the preferred vendor at negotiated rates and those kinds of things. And here again, I think the feedback from the survey is a little bit mixed. That on average, only slightly better than half of total spending, 55%, is compliant to the contract. So, why do you think this continues to be a challenge for so many organizations to drive the potential savings or paper savings from a sourcing process to actual realized savings by ensuring compliance to contract?
Yeah, so I think experience has been that one of the big strategic errors that procurement people make sometimes is that after we've negotiated a contract, we've reported the estimated savings based on the price of spend this year and what we anticipate the spend would be in the new year. We tend to walk away from that as a completed activity, and it's now up to the organization's users of that service or that vendor to simply execute on it. The risk is that spend that's not monitored will, in fact, ultimately be leakage of savings. I it's really important for procurement folks to understand that signing the contract is just the very first step in delivering the savings that we've negotiated. I've encouraged my folks, and this is how we do it with our cost savings reporting, is acquire them every month to monitor savings of the contracts that they've signed. So when we report savings, we're not reporting savings for an entire year all at the front end of the process when we sign the contract. I ask our people to basically report the savings as the spend under that contract occurs. So an annual contract, I make them basically prove to internal auditors that the invoices from that vendor are in fact delivering the savings that we've negotiated up front. We put much of that burden back on the vendor to prove that, so that we don't have to do all the legwork. But a little extra work, but I see it as part of the credibility issue I talked about earlier with our stakeholders. And I also think it's the credibility we build with our internal auditors, that we're not just reporting savings and then forgetting about it, that we're following through to make sure that those savings are delivered. I think when you do that, you're more likely to see yourself at the higher end of this range on this slide, where you're having the leakage of your contracts not delivering the savings that you promised.
Yeah, sounds like the kind of rigor that you've put into the process is really key to making sure those savings matriculate from the identified stage to realized. And, you know, I think oftentimes we talk about non-compliant spending being maverick spending, and it implies almost a willful disobedience. But I think in most cases it's more just, you know, you have visibility, you know, that probably the employees, end users or requesters in the business they're not willfully going out and saying, let me go do maverick purchase, right? It may just be that they don't have the visibility to make it easy for them to do the right thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would also agree that there are situations where they're honest, and other cases where the mistakes are what I call unintended consequences, whereas there's not a follow-through accountability. Let's just call it the laziness of laissez-faire practices allows to pass along costs that they may not think are price increases, but ultimately shouldn't have been passed on according to contract. But if nobody challenges it along the way, it can easily become lost in the noise. So accountability and the follow-up is really important, I think, if you're going to deliver the compliance and ultimately the savings that you've promised and reported. And I go back to don't report savings until you can actually verify that they've been delivered.
And so we've kind of looked, Steve, at the state of procurement and the procurement present, and kind of how is procurement perceived strategically? Do we have a mandate? Those kinds of things. We've examined some critical benchmarks here as it relates to organizational performance. And next I wanted to segue into technology adoption and technology enablement. So we all know that the formula is an alchemy of people, process, and technology, but now we got to my favorite part. Just to really examine the state of technology adoption and technology enablement. So we're going to go into some detail in sort of each of the functional areas within source-to-pay technology, but at a broad brush level, looking across that stack, if you will, a couple of interesting takeaways from our survey here. One is that there's so much about technology innovation and how dynamic the space is. It's almost somewhat surprising then that, a fairly small minority, 16%, say we've got state-of-the-art technology. So, in fact, our respondents were twice as likely to say, 33% said we're behind the curve, opposed to being ahead of it with state-of-the-art. And as we look at sort of the deployment models that are in use here, I guess that's a clue to the relative dissatisfaction that the 2/3 are saying we're using essentially homegrown or ERP legacy type systems to manage our procurement processes, where just 18% are using a standalone best-of-breed tool, or 14% using an integrated suite. So why do you think there are so many that are sort of still behind that curve of adopting a best-of-breed tool when it comes to technology for procurement?
I would say that the factors that seem to be the greatest obstacles for most folks in procurement to thinking of alternatives to homegrown and ERP-based procurement solutions is, one, cost, because the perception is that to find a better procurement system means to toss out your ERP system, which obviously in most cases sounds like a multi-million-dollar proposition. So I would say that's a false assumption, which I'll come back to. And I think the other is it's not an undaunting task to say tackle the chain management process associated with replacing procurement system or supplementing your procurement system or your ERP system with something that is a better tool. I think oftentimes we're our own worst enemies in terms of our unwillingness to either pursue a different technology than what we're using, or we don't have the support of upper management in investing in state-of-the-art tools. And this kind of goes back to what we said, to which degree is, let's just say, the C-suite supportive of what procurement is trying to accomplish, and also to what degree are you, as procurement, able to tap into any of the dissatisfaction of the stakeholder base in terms of the existing procurement system solutions. Because I think if you can tap into the C-suite and you can tap into the stakeholder dissatisfaction, you can actually change the opportunity to move to a new technology.
In your own case, Steve, in transitioning, if you will, from an ERP base to a best of breed, what were factors, I guess, that appealed to you of adopting an integrated suite approach for source to pay, as opposed to a standalone or point solution approach?
So I have invested in technology in several different companies that I have worked with, and I've the best of breed solution, and that will work. It's better if you have no tools. Getting a best of breed tool for an application is than not any tool. But what I've learned over the years of putting in best of breed solutions that don't necessarily integrate with each other, or if you're back into your ERP system, is that they take you so far and you still have some inefficiencies associated with either double entry of information, or that the information can't be shared in such a way that you can use a system as a list for the other system. So own learning through this process has been that an integrated solution will work better. It also means that if you're trying to do this all at once, you're going to invest in more money. So sometimes the best of breed gives you a way to do this in increments where it doesn't cost you so much in each increment. But I still think the integrated solution is the ultimate goal. I inherited solutions here at the College Board where we had a legacy ERP system that everybody in the organization from a procurement perspective hated. So that worked out in my favor because nobody was clamoring for us to make that system the right system to continue to use. But I also knew that we weren't going to replace it. So I had to find a solution that could bolt on and integrate with our e-system. And I had the two goals. It needed to be able to bolt on and integrate back into the system, and then any tool I added, any module I added, any additional functionality I added had to be integrated within this bolt-on solution as well as back into the ERP solution. So that, to me, were the hot button items in terms of how I made my ultimate decision.
Well, yeah, great guidelines there for the critical decision process to make that transition. Back at the beginning, we said, what is your top priority for 2018? It was, how do I make this transition from tactical to strategic? And the technology adoption is such a critical element of achieving that. So I'll remind everyone logged in today that you'll be getting the full slide deck, and you'll also be getting links to with the slide deck to access the full contents of the report. So as we segue here, we actually have a drill down into each particular slice of technology adoption. And, you know, looking at the first one here, spend analytics, there's a lot of data here. I'm not even going to attempt to cover it. You'll get the full content in the report itself, but we'll just kind of breeze through these really quickly, Steve, and a couple of high-level takeaways. Spend analytics, the source-to-pay stack, had the highest penetration. So it echoes your earlier comment, Steve, how foundational and critical it is, but not always adopted. Many are looking to improve and upgrade this capability. So as you get spend analytics, other things, since many are looking to upgrade right now, Steve, what would your advice be to kind of focus on keys to success in spend analysis?
Yeah, so I would say that the two things that I've learned in trying to collect better spend data has been that you must have a taxonomy is procurement and serves the procurement needs. So oftentimes I think many organizations that might even have answered this survey question as yes, we have a spend analysis capability, they'd be relying on a legacy ERP system that has the data, but is oftentimes based on that ERP system's GL structure or on some other rather crude taxonomy categorization processes that may or may be optimized for either that company or for the procurement department's needs. So I think that one of the things I would emphasize is that while I totally agree that spend analytics is the most important tool in our talks that will help get better, it's so important that you have made your taxonomy is right, and that your spend analysis is driven by AI or artificial intelligence. And I think it's important in the sense that it allows that system to be able to learn from the way in which you want your categorization to take place, so that as more data comes in, it is properly categorizing it as you go and getting better and better at that. Often spend analytics companies will talk about 80-90% categorization accuracy. My goal is 100%, and if you've got AI, you have more of a chance of achieving that. And so those are the kind of two takeaways for me, is taxonomy and artificial intelligence.
Great. So into e-sourcing, now this is a fairly mature technology space, so I'm actually a little bit surprised that adoption is as low as it is. Just 55% had it. Those that do have it are most likely to be using a best-of-breed point solution or suite-based tool, and are pretty happy. You know, and then 20% say they feel like they're state-of-the-art. So, any perceptions on why adoption isn't higher, and what do you perceive as the value in e-sourcing?
I think the reason adoption is not as high is because some of the tools that I've seen and worked with are very complicated in terms of how they operate to basically take an RFP process that's manual and use a system to operate it. The tools that are the most simple and straightforward are the ones where the adoption is going to be greater. And I think that's kind of a principle that you can apply to any tool. I mean, ERP, some of your largest companies like Oracle and SAP have probably very robust procurement solutions, but they're sometimes so complicated in their ability to handle everything that they become hard for users to adopt and hard for them to understand unless they're in it every single day. So I think the same can be true for any technology you buy for any of these tools. Everything is not easy if you've got all the steps that go into an RFP, especially when you start trying to compare bids. So I think my takeaway is it's a thing to have an ability to do a complicated RFP electronically, but also important that you have the ability to do something in a streamlined fashion that truly is going to be more efficient than some of these RFPs, and I think that's what's driving or not driving adoption that we would expect.
Your ease of use statement holds true as we look at many of these other functional modules as well, Steve. So contract management has relatively higher adoption, 70% say they have it, but really pretty low satisfaction. I think your explanation would hold true here as well. The ease of use with the sort of garden variety CLM out there for contract management, probably not where it needs to be, or at least many are looking to refresh that technology, as we see 25% planning to upgrade, or additional 17% poised to make the initial investment. I think once again, your focus is right on point here, that focus on ease of use to drive higher adoption levels. Supplier management.
I'll back and just Can I just back and make a comment about contract management? Because I think the other big reason why you have a lot of folks that have it but don't always have folks that are happy with it is because sometimes, in many cases, including at the College Board, the contract management solution that's in place is not integrated back into the rest of the tool set that Procurement uses, including the ERP system. Sometimes the contract management piece has to be entered separately, meaning everybody has to enter data twice, and that is I know in my case that's where the dissatisfaction comes from. So we're part of that planning to upgrade category, where we will get an integrated solution.
And you know, the integration touch points being downstream of the e-sourcing process to have that flow into the contracting process, and in some respects upstream then of procure to pay, and having it integrated into the P2P process too. See, supplier management came out as the top investment target. You know, there's just more and more focus on improving supplier relationship management, doing a better job of managing and mitigating risk, and that's reflected, I think, in numbers here as well, as the number of people that plan to invest in that space. Procure to pay, certainly. Near two-thirds have it. We are looking to upgrade, especially since in this area we really see that the EP and legacy tools seem to still be the predominant model adopted here, and then might attribute that to the lower satisfaction levels. But interesting perspective, Steve, why is P2P so foundational for procurement organizations?
My ad is because it touches everybody in the organization. You can have spend analytics, and you can have e-sourcing and supplier management, and you're primarily talking about a subset of the organization that's going to use those tools. When you start talking about requisitions and invoices and the whole process of approvals and payments, all from soup to nuts, you're seeing a lot of the organization, from the lowest level employee to the most senior levels of the company. So I just think it's got to be critical that you have a procure-to-pay system ultimately user-friendly, that integrated with some of your other solutions and tools, and is easy to use.
We've kind of covered off the core functional modules that encompass source to pay. I'm just going to flip through very quickly here some of the extensions that many folks are either implementing or looking to implement. One is a project management capability that wraps around source to pay processes, and penetration is relatively low here. It's 58%, but many more looking to add that. Request management, kind of a front end, the procurement process. A lot of folks have some method for doing that. In many cases, ERP or legacy systems as well. So many more looking to refresh or upgrade that capability. When it comes to savings tracking, we've talked so much about savings and being able to report that. Again, this is something that many organizations are attempting to do, sometimes with spreadsheets or other homegrown systems in most cases, but kind of an emerging space for best-of-breed tools to be able to integrate all these activities and be able to track savings as they move through the life cycle. Supplier network, a critical area of significant upgrades being planned in this area to improve supplier collaboration and really digitizing the process means not just doing it within the four walls of my enterprise, but how I extend out externally to my suppliers. Overall, how much of the functionality are people using in the procurement tools that they have? On average, it's a little bit better than 50%, which at first blush might be a little bit disappointing, but technology overall, it's just in the procurement technology space, but generically, 20 to 30% of functionality is usually used. So I think a takeaway here is actually pretty high for procurement utilization. Naturally, everyone wants that to continue to trend upwards. So I wanted to make sure we had some time for prognostication, Steve. We asked folks to tell us what they see happening 5 years down the road in the procurement of the future. And one of the big areas, of course, is technology innovations, these emerging technologies such as AI, artificial intelligence, or the Internet of Things with connected devices, blockchain, that kind of shared immutable ledger of transactions, or things like robotics, RPA, robotics process automation. So we could spend an hour, we could spend days on this topic, but as you look at this list, Steve, which do you think might have the biggest impact on procurement in the future?
So I believe that any technological tool is not an end in of itself, but has to drive, going back to what I said earlier in the presentation, the ease of use and ultimately stakeholder engagement. The worst list right now for me is artificial intelligence, because that is available. The technology is relatively mature, and many of the tools that we've talked about earlier use artificial intelligence behind the scenes. If I can automate a manual process or can make it move more quickly through the steps to complete, easing the burden either on my team or easing the burden on the requisitors and the stakeholder at the organization, and ultimately even the supplier, then I've accomplished what I think technology is designed to do. Other than that, I'm not particularly enamored with technology, but on the other hand, it's a useful way to achieve my ultimate goal, which is to make procurement more effective in delivering value to the organization. I'm not ready yet to fully embrace blockchain and internet, because I think they're bleeding edge abilities, and I'm still in that. I'm not best of class yet. So when I am best of class, I'll be ready to tackle on some of these other technology capabilities that are coming, but I think they're not mature yet, and I will be ready to apply them when it may become more mature. But for me, it's artificial intelligence.
Yeah, good advice. Stick to the basics in some respects. You're not going to do technology just for technology's sake, but where there's something that's real, available today, like AI, make the maximum use of it. I think great takeaways there as well. So we ask folks to kind of tell us their vision, and these quotes encapsulate some of those visionaries, and where we had consensus on a lot of different points, we almost have some divergent views of what the future holds here. So, Steve, really be interested in your vision for future procurement 5 years down the road.
Well, just as I just mentioned, if technology can drive out some of the manual processes that have traditionally and historically defined procurement, then I do believe the future is bright for procurement becoming more as a strategic consultant to the organization, aiding them to the decisions about how to achieve best value and drive the business forward. That means that technology could essentially remove the tactical components of procurement to where it becomes both seamless and transparent to the end user, including the procurement folks. So that's how I see procurement evolving over the next year, where we continue, going back to an earlier slide, moving from tactical to strategic value.
And kind of a great way to put the capstone on our session today. Amazing that we got through that much content in 1 hour, Steve. and want to thank you for all the valuable insights that you've shared. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, folks can get the full content of the full report for download here, and you'll get within 48 hours an email thanking you for attending today with the slide deck. In the slide deck are links to the report. It's so voluminous that it's broken into parts 1 and 2. But we've tried to hit the high points for you today, but really encourage you to go through the details and really extract the value by being able to benchmark your organization and really figure out where gaps may be, what some strategies are to close those gaps to continue moving forward. And before we leave you today, I also wanted to remind you, Zycus, we hold our annual event called Horizon. It's coming up at the end of October. And very much like today's session that's focused on thought leadership and value add, that's what you'll get by attending this Horizon event, actually close to home for both of us, Steve, in Leesburg, Virginia, where Procurement Intellect meets digital technology. And you'll meet Procurement Intellect by coming here, including Suze, who will be a featured speaker on the agenda for Horizon this year as well. And with that, and I mentioned there's a promo code here that will get you a discount for attendance at the conference. So with that, I want to thank you, Steve, for your participation and the valuable insights that you shared. I think you've given folks a lot to take away and really take to heart and act upon.
Well, thank you, Richard. My pleasure.
And thanks, everyone, for attending. Please look for the email that will give you the slide deck and the links to the downloads of the report and your continuing education credit. And thanks so much for participating today.